Well, hello, friends, Endow ladies, listeners, Endow hosts. I'm back with Stephanie Burke and Claire Dwyer from the Avila Institute. We are so excited. This is week 6, chapter 6, the science of love. We're getting there. The Jubilee year of St. Therese. I don't know if you've asked her for graces, but I certainly have a long list of things that I'm asking Therese for. And one of them is that this podcast series will bless all of you and inspire you to go deep into this fantastic saint through this Endow study. So welcome back, ladies.
Great to be back.
Yeah, excited.
I know. I'm so excited. Okay, Claire, you had some strong thoughts and feelings about this chapter. So what should we talk about first?
Oh my goodness. What should we talk about first? You know what? There's so much. I highlighted a few lines about her writing and having not being able to write 10 lines without being disturbed. Just as an aside, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm not alone. And all of the distractions, and Heather points out, like any writer or any mother will commiserate with the incessant interruptions and distractions, which Therese took as opportunities to practice charity. It's kind of remarkable she wrote as much as she did, because it sounds like she didn't have much time to do it. And she was under total obedience to the rhythms of the life of the Carmelites in the convent, and only had a little bit of free time. And then because of her charity to others, she allowed them to have whatever was left over. So I don't know. I really found that to be consoling, because I totally identified.
Fully interested.
You can hear her sense of humor in that story. It's so funny because she says, here I was under obedience to write my story, and I'm sitting in the garden, and I think it was the gardener, she said, kept coming by and going, I hope I'm providing a bit of a distraction from that tedious work of writing, so this person's like trying to love her, away from having to do the one thing that she passionately wants to do and she desires to do. And she responds with love and just embraces that. And I think it's just delightful.
It reminds me of, like, what mother hasn't just tried to lock herself in a bathroom just for a moment of peace, and the little hands on the doorknob.
Before, like, knocking, yeah.
Or sliding stuff under the door, or looking under the door, mommy.
No, but I mean, I think, and like really by this time in our study, the suffering of Therese, and we've touched on it so much. It was physical suffering, it was emotional suffering. She was watching her father die. She was being perfected by grading against the personalities of everybody in the convent. Not everybody there was as close to sanctity as she was. But also she was being purified of any idea that she was going to be able to do any of this work of sanctification on her own.
Mm-hmm.
And her spirituality is deepening. And so she's becoming aware of, like, we become so painfully aware of our own limitations.
Mm-hmm.
And the phrase, like, there but for the grace of God, becomes so much more meaningful, because we do know that we need a savior.
Yeah.
And Therese discovers that, and rather than allowing that to deflate her ambition to be holy, she decides to lean into it and lean into her own littleness and allow God to be God. And man, we could spend a lot of time on that.
Yeah, it's so powerful. So powerful. She, and I think a lot of that, and I mentioned this in the last episode, but, we can often, in our own self-assessment of our insufficiency, we're busy, we've got work, we've children, families, spouses, or whatever, and we can think, I don't know enough. How can I dare come speak about this on a podcast with Endow, or how can I be on a radio or whatever? How can I stand up and speak in front of people, or even talk to my friends about the church? I don't know what words to say. We can see it through the eyes of insufficiency. And we look at her, and she read, 3 books outside of the Bible, the Spirit, St. John of the Cross, the Spiritual Canticle, Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, and Jean-Pierre Coussaud's Abandonment to Divine Providence, which I think is where this, because that particular work is really central on abandoning all things to God, just this complete surrender, and learning how to integrate that way of abandonment in everyday life is the way to sanctity. It really is a way of we need to understand that everything that happens to us, you know, the little things to the big things, the small storms, the small disturbances, the small little clouds floating by, to the huge tempests that happen within the course of our everyday life, is either willed or permitted by God.
Yeah.
Right. And the quicker we figure that out and abandon that to the Lord and embrace it, then he can work miracles in us. He can purify us. We don't have to have all the answers. We don't have to be perfect. We don't have to bootstrap everything, but we need to be peaceful and trusting, and understand we have an extraordinary Father, and he doesn't miss a thing, not a thing. You know, we recently walked the Camino, and we had the gift of walking with Joseph Pierce, who writes on the.
Wow, very good. How
It
cool.
was awesome.
How
Yeah,
cool.
it was great. So he was writing on the Christian themes through Tolkien's writings and literary.
Oh my gosh, Stephanie, I did not know he was on the Camino with you. How cool. How cool. That's awesome.
Yeah, it was really beautiful. And one of the things that he said on one of the talks, it has just like steered its way into my brain. And I think it's so important for us to understand, in that the Lord is not in the business of mass production. So when you look at creation, it's all an artwork for each one of us. You know, everything that we see when we look out into creation, everything that's happening in our lives, those are part of God's work. They are God's work that's necessary for us. And he is so attentive to the details, and we can be so trusting and understanding of that when we understand that even when you look at two leaves from an oak tree, and if you were to hold up those two leaves and look at them underneath a microscope, even though they came from the same tree and they're both oak leaves, they're as different as individual fingerprints.
I love that. I had no idea. Incredible.
So the Lord is attentive down to the minutiae. Two blades of grass are as different as fingerprints are. We can tell they're both grass, but they're significantly different. So everything that happens to you, Simone, in your daily life, everything that happens to Claire, everything that happens to me, to our loved ones, is there by his will, his design. And if we can meditate and stay there in that thought, we can completely abandon ourselves to him, knowing that there's nothing that's going to happen to us in this moment that is beyond his control, and that he's not bringing about a greater good through it if I'll surrender and embrace it, right?
Yeah, you reminded me of, I used to really be into, not because I'm Egyptian, but not because I'm Egyptian, beetles. And there's so many, there's such a diversity of beetles. And there's this like British beetleologist who was asked, like, what can you decide, like, what can you say about God from your study of beetles? And he said something like that God is very fond of them because there's so many of them, size, shape, color, season, you know. And I would just think, when you were talking about the leaves and the oak tree, like just the diversity and the creativity of God and all of that. But Stephanie, what you're saying is true. It presupposes that God is good. And I think that you can only have that abandonment if you first believe that God is good. And I think you can only really come to believe in God's goodness if you go hard at prayer and paying attention to the details.
And abandonment.
And abandonment.
Because if you'll throw yourself in it and watch what happens, it's remarkable. It's remarkable. You know, and real quickly, my daughter, you know, she's in her 30s, and she lost her job due to downsizing. Like from one day to the next, it was gone. And so no income, no nothing. And as we were talking about this, and I was telling her about God's providence and coach, just loving her, being a mom in that moment, right? I told her in a particular difficult moment, I said, embrace what's happening and surrender to it. God's got you. He will not abandon you. This is an invitation. Resist the temptation to go bitter, to get angry or frustrated, and to go dark. Stay soft, stay in the light, stay close to God, keep surrendering, keep trusting every single day, and watch what God does. And not only did she get a better job, it's higher paying by a fourth, 25% higher pay. She's got greater flexibility, all these things. And the Lord just brought all this goodness through it. And it was just a tremendous test for her. And I think she passed, Of course, I'm going to score a bit higher than others, but,
Yeah, I think there's a line, maybe it was in the last chapter, maybe it's in this one, I'm not sure, but it's in one of these two, about do we think God's like mad at us when we aren't as perfect as we think that we ought to be, or things don't go our way. And I think when I confront that during the day, like just these attacks of like inappropriate guilt or shame, or God must be mad at me because I still don't have this together. It's like I have to stop and remember that, and this is very Thérèse, where Thérèse is so helpful, that like God is my father. He loves me very much. He is doting on me. Sure, I'm absurd about things throughout the day, and he delights in it, and it's fine, and I can begin again. And then just that mindset shift, which is not like a positivity mind trick. It's actually a fact that God is my father and does love me. He's not mad at me. Then I have that interior freedom again to just surrender and abandon to whatever the reality of the day presents.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the quotes that it's mentioned on page 74 is that merit does not consist in doing or in giving much, but rather receiving and in loving much. Yeah. It's and as women, this being the Endow podcast, as women, we have that tremendous grace to be receptive by our design. So I think it's just, I think it's fully embracing our authentic femininity. So
I would agree with that. Claire, was there something else you wanted to talk about? Because there was also, we wanted to talk about the nonviolent love of God. There's so, again, so much.
I'll just add to the conversation about the intricacies of God's knowledge and creation. There's this beautiful poem by the Carmelite poet Jessica Powers, and she's talking. She has this image of an oak tree in winter, and like the snowflakes falling on the branches. And she says like something to the effect of, God has measured the weight on that branch down to the last snowflake. In meaning like that God knows your suffering and he knows what you can bear. And he is very carefully interested in all of it. There's nothing outside of his concern. And it, even the tiniest snowflake, he's well aware of the weight that is on you. So it's not just like this vague idea of God, like he's got you, he loves you, it's all going to be okay. But like he is intricately involved in every moment of every suffering that you've known. He suffers with you. It's not outside his knowledge, and it's not outside his permission. And he will not give you what you cannot bear. Anyway, I find that so beautiful and hopeful.
What do you tell to someone, not that I'm thinking of several people, what do you tell to that person who says, God doesn't care about your parking space?
He does. I just the other day, I was at the grocery store and there was like the one shady spot. Well, I attributed it to St. Joseph being a gentleman. I was like, thank you for finding a parking spot for me. I think if we live alert and aware, God is intimately invested in everything. There's nothing, if he's aware of a sparrow falling to the ground or how many hairs on your head, I think he cares about parking spaces.
Yes, he does. And not only that, if you're parking and you have to walk a little farther, and along that sidewalk, you smile at somebody and change their day,
Yeah.
or you have a conversation, or the timing is such that you're holding the door open for a grandmother, of course he cares about that parking space.
Yeah.
See, we can't limit it to the parking space. We have to understand all the other parts that go with it.
Yeah.
I'm very
and when you
interested in
start to
parking
look at it,
spaces, though, because I drive a 12-passenger van. So the Lord has to help me a lot with parking
that's
spaces.
right. That's right. You have a particular,
I have a particular need
grace
for
there,
parking
yes.
spaces. And when you
Yes, you
say
do.
that, Simone, it's like, oh, yes, he is. Oh, yes, he does.
And it's
Yeah.
mainly men that I'm talking to about this. They're like, yeah, there's a God.
Yeah. Save your prayers. Save your prayers for what really
Yeah.
matters,
Yeah.
right? And there, I mean, there's truth to that. There's certainly things that are of much more spiritual significance, and we don't spend our time like an hour praying for a parking space. But I just think it's this idea that God is not removed at all. Worst song in the world, God is watching us from a distance. Like, absolutely not.
Gosh, that's a song. I've never heard that song. That's hilarious.
That
Yeah,
Midler.
it's terrible.
It's a bit.
Yeah, it's from a distance. It's called From a
I
Distance.
do know that
Yeah,
song. I
it's
forgot
terrible.
about that song.
I actually sang it when I was 15. Terrible. Thank
Oh.
goodness we didn't post videos back then.
You think that's bad, Stephanie? In my high school senior book, this is where life is a black comedy. God has a sense of humor. You don't know anything in your high school. I quoted for my senior quote, Simone de Beauvoir, who of course I had no idea who she was.
She had a great name, though.
She had a great name, and I liked her name. I thought it was a cool name, Simone de Beauvoir. About one is not born a woman, what becomes one, which is like so contra feminine genius, so contra our faith, collaborator with Paul Sartre. I mean, she's not a good
This
force.
is
Not a good role
going back
model.
to the
Not a
last
good-
episode. This is God laughing and
This
being
is-
like,
this
okay, I'm
is-
going to let you do this. We're going to have a good laugh about this later.
Exactly. I totally forget. I look at my yearbook last year. I'm like, oh my gosh, who are you? Why? What? How could this happen? But I thought it meant to grow in virtue. One is not born a woman, one becomes one. In my 18-year-old head, it was like you have to cultivate virtue, blah, blah. That's not what she was talking about. Anyway, God is funny. And now I work for Endow. So
I want to go to something that that Claire quoted, about the snowflakes, about the Lord measuring the weight of those snowflakes, is how many snowflakes could land on that branch before it breaks. Because that's where it's alluding to, and to these trials in our lives. And I think we tend to look at the trials in a way that says, oh, I'm supposed to bear this. And if I bear this, then, I've done the right thing if I've abandoned it to the Lord. But we don't understand that the pressure of that extra snowflake, those snowflakes that are piling up on the branch of our soul and our heart and our mind and our spirit are ways of exercising us to bring us into who we are called to be.
yeah.
Right. So the sick parent, right, and having to set aside everything, to care for them for a while, the sick child, the child with an illness, the everyday burdens of life, those make us who God wants us to be if we embrace them, because it's going back to the sandpaper, they purify us, they strengthen us, they bring up a particular virtue that we need to grow in. So we don't miss anything, and hopefully we don't miss anything of all these invitations. But what I love, to kind of make a bridge to love, is the love of God is nonviolent, is the way that she approached. And I think this goes back to her this sense of humor that she has, because she almost has like a glint in her eye as she's writing these things to me. I always just feel like she's kind of glancing across the table as she's saying this, and gives me a quick look saying, did you catch that? Because it's pretty funny, right? But she talks about the annoying nun, the crotchety nun, which is the words that Heather King uses, and the emotionally disordered nun. And, down to a sister sitting behind her, a nun, flicking her rosary on her teeth, and how she decided to focus on that and make it an offering to the Lord, and talks about, instead of turning around and, glaring her down or letting it distract her from prayer or whatever.
Right.
And then even choosing to serve the emotionally disordered nun who is so embittered, so grumpy. If she walks fast, you're walking too fast. You need to slow down. If you walk too slow, you're not walking fast enough. You didn't roll my sleeves perfectly well. You know,
Right.
you didn't cut my food the way I wanted it. And I mean, it's a classic case of narcissism, right? You can't win for losing.
Right.
And she shows us how to love in that circumstance in a way that's, I think, extraordinary. It is sanctity, you know.
I love that line on page 78. She has the faculty of displeasing me in everything. In her ways, her words, her character, everything seems very disagreeable to me. I underline that because I want to use that to my sister at some point. I will say, you have the faculty of displeasing me and everything. Like, it's such a great line, but like, how relatable is that?
Yeah.
The people that we encounter. Yeah. But so then how is that non-violent then? Because it's, at least in my ear, it seems a bit violent. Like, because I want to lash out at the annoying person. I want to say, you're driving me.
Oh, but God is not, he's not violent. The
Yeah.
reaction to lash out is not of the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah.
That I think that's where that's going, you know, because she said in the she said, when I was tempted to answer back in a disagreeable manner, right? How many of us have thought about answering with our teeth gritted, you know, with that steely look, that sarcasm, that sharpness, that, you know, ugly tone, right? Even if it's not horrid, it's just sharp enough to get our point across, you know, to be too direct. She
Mhm.
said, I was content instead with giving her my most friendly smile and with changing the subject of the conversation. For the imitation of Christ says, it is better to leave each one in his own opinion than to enter into an argument. You
Oh,
know,
lose them there. My goodness.
yeah, very, very powerful quote from the Imitation of Christ. It's, you know, we have a tendency, I think, especially, well, and I can't even claim it as American. I think we all have this tendency. Comes, you know, it's so evident in Facebook culture. We have this need to fix other people,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right? And to just go to the jugular. And we even do it within the church. We see it within different, you know, the Latin rite against the Novus Ordo, those that kneel to receive on the tongue, which those who receive in the hand, you know, there's all this arguing and setting each other straight. And, you know, that's not of the Lord.
Yeah. And
Are
it's such a scandal to the outside world that should look to Christians to be unified.
it
It's so
is.
scandalous.
It is, you know, and, you know, do I have a preference? Of course I do. You know, do I veil? Yes. I kneel. Yes. You know, but that doesn't mean I have any business fixing anybody else.
Yeah.
You know, I need to pray and surrender to the Lord so that he can make something of me instead of just, you know, this pile of nothingness.
You reminded me, I was in Israel 10 plus years ago, and I met this woman on the trip who, because my preference is, again, the church allows both, is to receive communion on the tongue. And this woman said to me, oh, you know, Christmas is coming up, and I was praying and I asked Jesus, what do you want for your birthday this year? Which was, that's so sweet. I never heard of anybody doing that. And he told me he would like me to start receiving communion on the tongue. And I was like, oh my goodness, isn't that amazing that, again, it's totally, both are allowed. It's fine. Right. But I thought it was so beautiful that in terms of the way I'm looking at it with my Simone preference, I didn't need to like quote correct her, even though it's not something to be corrected because you don't want to be more Catholic than the church, but like the fact that Jesus himself communicates to us, and that if we become the sort of people who are praying, then whatever it is that we need to be refined or corrected or whatever it is, like he'll let us know. We don't need to violently insert ourselves. Claire, you mentioned that you wanted to talk about page 85, martyr, victim, and Holocaust.
I did. So wrapping up this chapter, of course, on page 82, there's a section about, this is really pivotal and key for understanding her spirituality, that she had desired to offer herself as an oblation to merciful love. And we talked in the past about the culture at the time, the church culture, being very Jansenistic in this idea of justice.
Mhm.
And so in Thérèse, in her prayer, encounters a God of mercy and desires to offer herself to love as a Holocaust, which is like a strong word. And Heather points out, like, these words like martyr and victim and Holocaust can be transformed by saints into something beautiful rather than gruesome. And it reminded me, because Thérèse, of course, was not a martyr in the traditional sense of the word. That's reserved, there's martyrdom by blood, but there's another kind of martyrdom. And what this reminded me of was something that I had come across when I was a young mom, meaning that wasn't so young myself anymore, but I had young children still. And I was reading something that Pope Francis had just said about a motherhood being a martyrdom. And I was like, whoa, what is that about? And so I opened this article, and it was quoting him during a Wednesday audience. And he was talking about Archbishop Oscar Romero, whose cause had just been advanced for canonization, who was a martyr in the traditional sense of the word. Mm-hmm. But the Pope was talking about how we are all called to a martyrdom of love. And so the Pope quotes Romero, and this is what he says. This was in 1977. Ironically, he was giving a homily. Romero was giving a homily during the funeral of a murdered priest. Mm-hmm. And he says, not everyone, says the Second Vatican Council, will have the honor of giving their physical blood, of being killed for their faith. But God asks the spirit of martyrdom of all those who believe in him. That is, we all have to be willing to die for our faith, even if the Lord does not give us this honor. We, yes, are available, so that when our time to give an account comes, we can say, Lord, I was willing to give my life for you, and I have given it. Because to give your life does not only mean to be killed. Giving your life, having the spirit of martyrdom, is to give in duty, in silence, in prayer, in the honest fulfillment of one's duty, in the silence of everyday life, giving life little by little. Mm-hmm. Yes, just as a mother gives, who without fear, with the simplicity of maternal martyrdom, I love that phrase, conceives a child in her womb, gives birth to the child, nurses it, helps the child to grow, and cares for it with affection. She gives life. This is martyrdom. And for all of us women who are called to give life, to die every day for the sake of the other, like, that has meaning. And I said, I wrote that we can die. And this is so generous of the church, isn't it? To take this title that we tend to think of as reserved for, like, the saints that are being beheaded, and sometimes it almost seems like that would be easier than to die a little bit every day. Yeah. But the church is generous in extending this crown to, like, everybody that's willing to give their life for the sake of the faith, but also for the sake of the other. And that's what we call white martyrdom. So I reflected on this in an article, and what I wrote is, the church is so generous in love, says we can die daily. We can die a white martyrdom. You can do what everyone is called to do, but few achieve. You can slowly but completely give of yourself, literally dying to yourself and to the world and all it holds out for you. You can die a little bit at a time to all the old desires and dreams, and live for Christ and all that he asks you to live for, and all who he asks you to live for. And you will do so quietly, and no one will know, and that will be part of the death. Oh, wow. And I think that's Thérèse. Like, nobody knew. Nobody knew. She died every day, and nobody knew. And that's part of the death to self, is that we do it in silence. So I would just think that these concepts give meaning to our suffering. Yeah. And if we see the saints as, like, examples, but we're not outside of that call on our life. So much to ponder there.
Yeah. And if I could add one thing to that, because that's so beautifully written. And maybe in the show notes, you can put a link to Claire's article, because I know firsthand how beautiful her writing is. But, you know, I think we also need to understand that in those deaths brings life.
Yeah.
Brings extraordinary joy, because we can, in our society of in our narcissistic society of putting ourselves first, of what about my needs, what about my feelings, what about my desires, if people could truly understand through the way of Therese and what you were talking about, the white martyrdom, it is the greatest source of freedom. It's the greatest source of joy and peace and life and light and just everything. It's him. And that's where our true fulfillment comes. But you can't understand that until you go through those small deaths. And so I would encourage our listeners, take those small steps, you know, choose the way that's least convenient, you know, that's least efficient, the way that we don't want to do it in small ways, and watch the Lord set you free every time you do that. And it'll give you the courage to take bigger steps along the way.
Well, and I don't think we have to like intentionally make it inconvenient. Life with its holy interruptions will determine that. And we don't really have time to talk about the let your yes mean yes and your no mean no and the whole people pleasing thing. But I think that idea that we're going to abandon ourselves, we're going to surrender, we're going to, you know, that is going to determine these holy interruptions, these inconveniences, the situations where we really aren't in charge and we're just letting him be our director, the way that Thérèse talks about Jesus being her spiritual director. He was my director. That really means that the codependency and the people pleasing, like that all has to go, because there's no part of that can really live with total abandonment. But I think I mean, Claire, your unpacking of Oscar Romero is so beautiful. And Stephanie, what I appreciate so much about what you just said is that, again, I'm obsessed with the idea of like, what does it mean to be a Christian? What's the Christian thing? And I think, and I was, again, talking to a friend about this, it's not the sort of thing that you can only, and Thérèse talks about this later, it's not the sort of thing that you can kind of half do and half enjoy. You have to be fully in. And when you're fully in, no matter how imperfect you are, because it's not the point, then things get really interesting. Mm-hmm. And I think you deprive yourself of the fascinating, interesting, weird, hilarious, absurd, all of that, if you don't totally surrender. Then things get interesting. Then Christianity is not boring. Then it's the actual thing, and not just images of things, because we don't just want to do Christian things. We want to be Christians. We want to be friends of Jesus. And that the last thing that is boring.
Yeah. Yeah. And Christian literally means to be a little Christ. Yeah. So it is that complete giving over of self as Christ did. And as you said, and I can attest to this, before I gave my yes, I completely came all in, you know, at 38, 39 years old. Up until then, I'd look at Christianity and man, I wanted to yawn. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm like, well, if that's being a Christian, I don't want that. That's boring. I want to live. I want to do things. I want to, you know, whatever. Right. That's just so full of the enemy's lie, because he always tries to divert us away from what's going to truly make us happy and what is a true adventure. Yeah. It can't, you know, so.
Yeah, that's before we're in the arena.
That's right. That's right.
Anyways, well, ladies, thank you so much for this conversation. Looking forward to next week.
Okay.